So what we're now thinking about is not so much an ideology, it's a practical project. If you live in my world, you hear a lot of people using the Manhattan Project or the Apollo Project. Apollo's 40 years old today. Almost to the day, actually, isn't it? About, what we need is an Apollo Project mentality. It's a metaphor which is just beginning to be slightly overused, which is a shame because it is actually a very powerful metaphor because it's a straightforward, can-do, let's-do-it project. And you could actually say that sustainable development is no more than making 9 billion of those lifestyles accessible to the 9 billion people in the world by using much less carbon, changing the way economics work to make poverty impossible, understanding well-being both emotional and physical, and using much less stuff. It's a practical problem which needs a practical outcome and a project mentality. And at the moment we don't think or talk like that because we're all confused with ideology, we're confused with the politics of consumption, and we need to unlock it. And I know a lot's possible. If I was doing 45 minutes, I'll talk a lot about B&Q, but B&Q is where I started my career, buying lots of timber from unknown sources. 10 years later, through third-party certification, all its wood was coming well-managed forests. And it's very interesting because when I was working for B&Q, the timber trade was destroying rainforests. And as we now know, the debate's got a lot more complex, and I'll come back to that later on. But it's very, very interesting because the biggest success for FSC was when the last edition of Harry Potter was printed on FSC paper. A massive, massive edition. This really matters because there's a very powerful message below this, which is how many people bought Harry Potter because it was FSC certified, and how many parents would dare not to buy Harry Potter for their child because it wasn't FSC certified. That's just a very powerful example of illustrating that historically we've been held back, that we've put too much emphasis on green consumers. This is about corporate policy decisions making the big decisions. It was the book publishers who said we cannot print such a large amount of paper and sell it on Amazon overnight in billions and billions and billions of copies without actually having this belt and braces extra security that we weren't trashing forests. And there's example after example after example where corporate and public policy has driven the change and not green consumerism. And the phrase you heard now is choice editing. If you look at the sales of fair trade bananas, it does that. And the verticals is every time a retailer has said, I'm only going to stock fair trade bananas and not offer my customers unfair traded versions. It's a massive way forward. Which means we've actually got quite a lot to learn from retailing. And it's really interesting when you look at retailing and you actually think, if the planet was a shop and we were running the planet like a shop, we would actually have quite a lot to learn. I'm biased, I like retailing because it's where I spent a lot of my time. But there's a very straightforward logic of retailers which isn't reflected in the way we run the planet. And so, for example, how many customers do we have? Well, we've all seen the population growth. Mankind, 160,000 years, last 200 years it's exploded. If you'd played around with your calculator and said the average age of a company in the UK is 30 years, between now and July, August, September, November, the next quarter, end of October, we're going to have 3,500% more customers. Because I've condensed the history of mankind into the average age of a British company. No company in the world in its 29th year has been able to accommodate 3,000% more customers, all buying a lot more stuff as well in the process. No retailer would buy from a supply base too small to supply its needs, but we've all heard the number. For everybody lived the lifestyle we have here in the UK at the moment, we would need 3 planets worth of natural resources. If Marks and Spencer's boxer short buyer went to Stuart Rose and said, we need 3 times more factories than we currently got to meet next year's supply of boxer shorts, that buyer would just get fired overnight. But that's how we're sort of thinking. That's the mentality behind the way we're managing our supply chains at the moment. We would know how much inventory we got. The same buyer could get a phone call from Rose and he'll say, how many boxer shorts have we got? And he'll tell you, we've got X amount in X stores, X amount in Lloyd's, X amount in the warehouse, X amount on the water, and X being made in our factories, goodness knows where. If you ring up Ed Miliband and say, how much oil have we got? Okay, that's a really good question, you know. Some think we're running out, and some think we've got 40 years. Ask the DEFRA how many bees we've got, and they say no idea whatsoever. But you imagine a British supermarket economy without bees, and it's pretty devastating. And this is a really good example where economics don't work. Bees are free, and that's why we don't value them. Bee population in the UK is in decline. And you just every now and then you get an interesting story about that in the UK. Oh, bees are in decline. That's interesting. Our economy is screwed without bees. Utterly screwed. And how could we invent bees? You know, if we cock up on credit, we cock up on finances, and what do? We get all the world leaders together and magic, 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 hokey pokey pokey, there's lots of money. They invent it. There's that big word, I can't remember what it's called now, but this big word where they actually basically say they print money. You can't print bees. So if the bee crunch is real, and all the trends are saying that we're facing a bee crunch, we can't just get all the chancellor successors together and invent bees overnight. But we can't produce food without bees. Good pricing. It takes 11,000 litres of water to make 1 quarter pounder, because that's all the water to grow the grass, all the water to feed the cow. I'm going to go home tonight and I'm going to make a beef burger. It will cost me £11 to make 1 beef burger. But Morrison's at the moment are advertising 4 beef burgers for £1. Why? Because the water's free. We wouldn't run our business that way, where the selling price is less than the cost of the raw materials. Sustainable development is running the global economy with the same disciplines as we run our own business and our own organisation. And that's why I now sort of just get very frustrated when people say, what's the business case for sustainable development? You invented it. It's running your business well. It's running your business like there is a tomorrow. It's running your business so there's resilience. The problem we're struggling is we don't have a board and shareholders in the same way as we run a company. So the good governance is hard to embed. So I've got 10 more slides which I'm going to rattle through. And what I'm going to do is do something nobody's ever done before. Is heaven to Betsy, we've achieved it. We've achieved 9 billion of those lifestyles by 2050. Wow. And you're going, but Alan, it looks no different. What's the difference? Now, of course, it would look different because we invent new toys and stuff, but visually, at the moment, I can't predict the future. But that guy's getting that type of lifestyle satisfaction from that lifestyle. One of the big differences is that phone can now talk to people in different times. So he's ringing up his predecessor and he's having a conversation with him saying, I live from a sustainable world. Tell us about that mad noughties years where you had all those planets and dead bees and everything. What's the difference? And he would actually articulate 10 fundamental differences between the way he lives his life and the way Mr. Sustainable Person lives their life.